What about that chair right there? No? I'm gonna sit over here. Wherever you.
Wherever you want.
Okay,
Hi.
I was just trying to do the space thing.
Thank you.
So am I cool right here?
Yes.
In the hood, we call them big waterhead boys. When they block everything. I didn't know if I was a big waterhead, dude.
So, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's event put on by the Center for California Studies. I'm Leonora Aileen, Executive Director of the Center, and people know about the Center because of the world famous Capital Fellows programs that we run, and the 64 amazing fellows who get placed in state government for a year and do amazing things in that short time. But we also run applied research programs and civic education programs. And today's program is part of our Envisioning California speaker series, in which we talk about policy issues facing Californians. The subject today is pandemic politics, and it stems from a recent article in a journal that the center helps to run called the California Journal of Politics and Policy. Professor Ted Lasher is the managing editor of that journal, and he's also professor of public policy and administration at Sac State. He'll be monitoring today's events. I'll do a brief introduction of our speakers today, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Professor Lasher. So Dr. Alana Jeydel is professor of in the Department of History and Political Science at Fresno City College. She received her PhD from American University, and her research is focused on women in politics, as well as state and local politics. Her book, Participation and Protest, Women in Politics in a Global World, co-authored with Dr. Sarah Henderson, was published with Oxford University Press. Her articles have appeared in California Politics and Policy, Political Research Quarterly, and State and Local Government Review. And her current research project explores the barriers that face female gubernatorial candidates, which appear to be formidable in the case of California, as we've never had a woman governor. And she teaches at Fresno City College, as I mentioned, and she's the author of a recent article that is the reason why we decided to do this event. Corin Chopin is a 20-year veteran of Sacramento political campaigns, specializing in public opinion research, fundraising, and campaign organizing. He began his political career in 2002 as the campaign manager for the successful Rancho Cordoba cityhood campaign, channeling civic pride into a 77.6% win for incorporation, formidable. Since then, he's helped elect over 25 candidates to public office, passed 10 ballot measures, built a database of 20,000 donors, and raised $3 million for local candidates and nonprofit agencies. He's worked for notable local electeds like Assemblymember Roger Dickinson and Councilmember Ray Trethewey. He most recently helped SMUD board member Greg Fishman, a longtime client, run unsuccessfully for Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, where he lost by under 1% of the vote. And since 2007, he's been a partner at Capital Campaigns, a full-service political consulting and public affairs firm. And he also consults with Sac State Consensus and Collaboration Program and teaches classes at Sac State and UC Davis Extension. Professor Lasher has been a professor of public policy at Sac State for over 25 years, has had a number of leadership roles during that time, including as associate dean and acting dean of the College of Social Science and Interdisciplinary Studies, as acting director of the Center for California Studies, and chair of the Department of Public Policy and Administration, where he currently teaches. His research scholarships focused on direct democracy, local elections, and public engagement efforts. He's received numerous scholarship awards, most recently the Virginia Gray Book Award for Initiatives Without Engagement as an outstanding book about state politics. He received that from the American Political Science Association in 2020. Ted, take it away.
Thanks, Leonore. I should also add that I was actually a Capital Fellow myself. I just don't ask me what year. So I'm very pleased to be here. And as Leonore mentioned, one of my other roles is as editor of the California Journal of Politics and Policy. And we're really proud of this journal. It has the aim to appeal to both an academic, including students, audience and practitioners and so we both publish articles from both academics and practitioners, and we're looking for people who are interested in that role. So if anybody in the audience has some things that they might think might be a good fit for the journal, I'd urge you to look at it online and contact me as appropriate. But the other thing is it's an open access journal, so anybody can get the articles at any time. And in terms of being practical things to think about, as you all know, there's been an enormous amount of writing about the COVID-19 and the impact in a whole bunch of areas, including about voting and about election issues. But there's actually been very little done about how the pandemic has affected campaigns. And that's why I think it's so interesting to have Alana give her perspective and based on her experience in an agency that monitors campaigns and her academic work. So with that, Alana.
I'm actually mic'd, so I'm gonna, can people hear me or should I? You good? Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm really glad to see you all today, and to those who are in Zoom land or webinar land. Thanks for joining us. So this work emerged from my time largely as managing the education program for the Fair Political Practices Commission, the state agency that is charged with regulating campaigns and lobbying. So where I'm going to go today is to just sort of talk always about why the question's interesting, right? Why is it interesting to look at how the pandemic impacted local campaigning? And really, I am mostly looking at campaigning, as Ted said, not so much, elections and how ballots were mailed or anything like that. I'll look at the impacts of the pandemic on the campaigns, a little bit on elections, what will remain from that, what will be tossed aside, and then Corin is going to jump in with some thoughts and we will take questions. So when I was at the FPPC, it was fascinating to work with local candidates. We worked with state candidates as well, but given the professionalized nature of running for state office, we tend to work more with local candidates who need more assistance navigating the Political Reform Act. And so it was really amazing during a pandemic to help them through this. And there were there's already barriers to running for office as a local candidate, and those barriers erupted massively. So a little background, as you all remember, on March 20th, we went into lockdown, and it was really unclear how long that lockdown would last and how it would impact November 2020. But by August, the California Secretary of State had issued technical and legal guidance, which is hyperlinked. So if you get a copy of the PowerPoint, you can look at that technical and legal guidance to assist cities and counties on the upcoming elections, noting that the pandemic would impact 2020, right? They were sort of predicting in August of 2020 that November of 2020 was going to be impacted by it. So local candidates, like those for city council and county supervisors and others, but those are the two main ones we tend to help the most, are required under the Political Reform Act of 1974 to file various campaign reports and statements depending on their campaign activity. And there's a hyperlink here for the Political Reform Act at the FPPC's homepage. The impact of the pandemic on local candidates attempting to navigate these legal requirements during a pandemic became apparent very quickly. Our phone lines were overrun. We were answering, in a normal month, we would answer about 300 questions from people calling in. We were answering 1,000 questions a month. We couldn't keep enough people on the phone. We couldn't run hours long enough to help people through this time. So I think this question is interesting because so many conundrums and challenges emerged so quickly, things that nobody had really had to give thought to before. So how does one get an original wet signature on required campaign forms and statements, reports and statements, when both the treasurer and the candidate don't live together probably, and no one is supposed to visit each other? Right? You were in a lockdown state at the time. So how do you get those required wet signatures? How does one open a campaign bank account? right? Things that nobody had really worried about in the past. They just walked into a bank and opened a campaign bank account. But it was, even though the banks were open, it wasn't considered healthy to be going into a public place. How does one campaign, right, when you're supposed to stay 6 feet apart and no one's going to answer the door? And many local candidates, we might laugh at that and think, oh, nobody's really doing face-to-face campaigning anymore. Oh, yes, they are, as most of you who work in local politics know, right? They're really doing a lot of face-to-face campaigning. So, you know, heretofore accepted methods went bye-bye during the pandemic. No fundraising picnics for the most part, no door-to-door canvassing, no shaking hands. And COVID-19 really did impact local campaigns and how they were conducted. And while some of the changes we're going to talk about had begun to emerge prior to the pandemic made their necessity a requirement. So one of the first major impacts was that pretty much everything moved online. Right? So over the past 10 to 15 years, we know that many campaigns, even local campaigns, have moved a lot of their work to the digital realm. But once lockdown began, that digital realm became pretty much the only place to conduct a campaign. Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram allowed candidates to interact with their constituents in ways that that many local candidates just hadn't used as much prior. We were interacting with a lot of local candidates who just didn't have familiarity necessarily with these platforms, and they had relied historically on more of a face-to-face game. So candidates who hadn't relied on these methods in the past quickly learned had to quickly learn appropriate advertising disclosures that they hadn't had to worry about before. And those disclosures can be confusing, right? Knowing how to appropriately disclose ads, we had local people calling in who thought that people were violating the disclosure requirements, right? I mean, so you had local candidates on high alert because they wanted to use these methods, but they were worried they were going to violate the law. And there were certainly, in a wonderful way, members of the public engaged and watching, but they didn't necessarily always know the law either. So there was a lot of confusion and activity on the part of candidates to learn ad disclosures that they didn't have to necessarily know in the past. Also, most of their meetings moved online with their consultants, their volunteers, their treasurer. These social media platforms became the virtual picnic, the virtual town hall, and the virtual handshake. And as the deaths soared and local candidates really came to realize that they were not going to be going back to the ground game. I mean, many of them kind of lived in a world thinking, well, by September or well, by October. But no, right? It quickly became clear that they would not be really navigating many sidewalks that campaign season. One San Jose City Council candidate, Jake Tonkel, noted that prior to the pandemic, he'd decided not to do very many live videos. But once the lockdown hit, his position changed. He and his team made them a mainstay. And so for local candidates, this move online was a significant shift in perspective and planning, right? And in particular, as we focus on planning, it really threw a lot of local candidates off. Any intent to be physically present in Walk the District had to be abandoned. And learning the correct PRA, Political Reform Act ad disclosures on sites like Facebook and Twitter was a hurdle for many of them who were not used to having to do that. And many candidates also struggled to learn electronic filing systems. So many local jurisdictions had actually adopted electronic filing systems for local campaign reports and statements prior to the pandemic. But you didn't have to use them, right? You could still turn things in, or they were transitioning to a place where you had to use it electronically. But once it got to this place where you really had to use it electronically, there was confusion about how to use those systems and how to upload those forms and reports. Candidates for the Ventura County Board of Supervisors seat, Oxnard Councilwoman Carmen Ramirez and Oxnard Mayor Tim Flynn, took to Zoom and Facebook to reach voters, saying this was a very big change for them from their historic strategy of walk, walk, and then walk some more, right? Another major impact was that everything moved online was also fundraising. Obviously, electronic fundraising, it existed before the pandemic, and for federal candidates, these were normal sites to use. Anadot, Venmo, Stripe, WinRed, ActBlue, PayPal, they all existed and had been regularly used. But as contributions in the 2020 cycle at the local level, even at the federal level and state level, were on the decline, candidates at all levels of government turned increasingly to these methods of accepting contributions. And Politico argued that amid all of the once-in-a-lifetime features of this election, the explosion of online fundraising may be the one that truly transforms politics over the time. And one of the things that I note at the end as a future question for inquiry is, will this transformation also change, in a sense, who is supporting local candidates, right? If you can just go on to ActBlue or Anadot or WinRed and just look for whatever candidates seem to fit your profile of policy preferences, you could live anywhere in the country and influence local elections anywhere in the country, right? So in a sense, is it the nationalization of local elections? I wonder about that. Journalist Amy Wada from CBS noted that text messages, that political text messages exploded during the pandemic. They went up to 2.7 billion political text messages in September of 2020. That was up from 1.8 billion the month before. And while it's not entirely due to coronavirus, it was a big part of it, right? Because that was the way to fundraise and reach people. And while we don't know exactly how often digital fundraising sites were used by local candidates, the evidence suggests that they were used more often during the pandemic than in the past. And again, for local candidates and what we were seeing, learning how to use these platforms and learning how to appropriately report them on campaign reports and statements was yet another hurdle. Learning how to deal, we got a lot of calls about fees, right? Because these sites often charge a fee. So, if somebody contributes $100, at which point they have to be itemized, but $350 was taken out, is that still a $100 contribution, or is it a $97.50 and we don't have to itemize? No, you do have to itemize. It's a $100 contribution. The fee is part of the contribution, essentially, right? So, these were things that confused them and could lead to problems if they didn't know, right? Things they didn't have to worry about before. Another major impact, everything took longer, lots longer. Candidates were taken by surprise as they were trying to file 410s and 501s, but in particular the 410, which is the statement that you're going to raise $2,000 or more that season or in that year. You get a number from the Secretary of State. So you file that form with the Secretary of State, and historically turnaround was a couple weeks from the time they received it. During the pandemic, they were months behind. Through no fault of their own. People were sick, people were working from home, more people were actually running for office. So it took a lot longer for candidates to get these signatures, which led to delays in filing. It took longer for candidates to open bank accounts because they had trouble finding time and essentially feeling safe, right, going to the bank to do that. And so many candidates were confused, right? Can I do anything if I don't have a bank account? How do I campaign when I don't have a bank account yet? So the Secretary of State issued guidance on compliance, as did the FPPC, and they were both very understanding of the difficulties that local candidates were facing, again, many of whom are not professional candidates. They don't necessarily hire professional accountants and consultants. But again, one of the things that we're seeing is, or we're wondering about, it's one of my questions at the end, is are we going to ultimately see sort of a change in who can run for local office? Will there be more of a demand for professionalized local campaigns? And there again is the hyperlink to the guidance the FPPC offered. So many local candidates were thrown off by that. And then finally, for the Fair Political Practices Commission, who offers training to local candidates and treasurers, most of those trainings had been done in person for years upon years, right? We traveled all over the state doing those trainings in person. But when the pandemic hit, so did stopping of traveling, obviously. But we don't want to stop traveling. And we had done, the FPPC had done online webinars in the past, so it wasn't like a brand new thing for them. They were familiar with Zoom and WebEx and things like that. But, you know, the trainings had, for the most part, historically been done in person. But when lockdown ended travel, webinars became the only game in town for training candidates and treasurers and helping them learn the ins and outs of their obligations under the Political Reform Act. And that's a link to the FPPC training and outreach page. So finally, what will remain? I am almost done. Electronic filing, right? I think that's one of the big things that we will see. Electronic filing systems for campaign reports and statements had been adopted prior to COVID, but local jurisdictions that had adopted them prior to the lockdown, they were supremely situated to deal with the pandemic in a way that other places were not, right? So they could handle those challenges. And it quickly became clear to jurisdictions without electronic filing that getting wet signatures on campaign reports and statements was difficult to impossible. And it also was challenging to staff local elections offices during a pandemic. And so, you know, while we hope that certainly this pandemic, you know, we don't enter into another pandemic anytime soon, I think we're more aware of the reality that it could happen, right? And that we need to be better prepared for what could happen. You know, and again, in the past, we didn't think this was going to happen. But I think now we're in a place where we're thinking about what do we keep so that should something like this happen, we're better prepared to help local candidates not freak out, basically. So I think the experience of the pandemic will likely prompt an increased adoption by local jurisdictions of electronic filing systems where the digital signature is considered the original signature, right? That really avoids a lot of issues. Electronic contribution vendors, they're obviously going to remain as checks and use of checks by and large has declined anyway for the last few decades. Virtual campaigning, I think that'll be more for Corin to speak to. I think that, you know, there will be some virtual work that still remains because it does make it a little bit easier to connect possibly with your volunteers, and it allows, just as we know we have about 35 people, you know, seeing this webinar. People like sometimes not having to leave their house after work and to being able to still meet with their staff and their volunteers. So I think some of that will remain because it is an efficient and convenient way to bring people together. But there's still a digital divide in many neighborhoods, which is something that local candidates mentioned as one of their concerns during the pandemic, was how do we reach our constituents who live in a world where there's a very big digital divide that still exists. That said, FPPC trainings will return to in-person, but webinars will maintain themselves. Because one of the wonderful things about webinars for training is that we can reach candidates and treasurers in parts of the state that didn't necessarily, you know, if you think about it, you know, we can travel anywhere. I mean, I'm not there any longer, but the FPPC, you know, the trainers can go anywhere. But, you know, there's some places where there's only a few people, or the next town is, you know, a long drive over in the winter. And so it was amazing to me how many people we reached across the state from tiny towns, people who'd never had training before, who didn't know what a Form 470 was, who didn't know, right? Like things that it really helped them. And so I think that those, I can't speak obviously for the FPPC, but I'm pretty sure that there will remain a robust webinar training system because they do offer a way to reach more filing officials and officers across the state. Questions for future inquiry, and then I am done. Does digital campaigning favor younger tech-savvy candidates and/or consultants? That's something that I think is interesting for future inquiry. Corin might think not, right? where do I go? But I don't think that means that, those of us who are over 30 are dinosaurs. But I do think there might be some very real impacts there in the use of TikTok and things like that. Will the pandemic upend some political careers of older established candidates who can't adapt to digital, not just campaigning, but electronic filing systems, ad disclosures? These things are actually somewhat confusing. And there's a lot of training and help, but for local candidates that don't necessarily want to hire a professional consultant and things like that, I think there will be some changes that we see in local elections. And this I alluded to earlier, will local races become less local and more statewide or even nationalized, right? As it becomes easier to solicit and accept contributions from across the state and across the nation due to the rise of digital fundraising. Concluding thoughts, research on local campaigns and elections has historically been scant, given the difficulty of gathering data across multiple jurisdictions. I remember getting some phone calls from graduate students who wanted to know where they could get all the campaign finance data for the local elections. I was like, here are the phone numbers for every city clerk in the state, have fun. And they're like, you're joking. And I was like, not joking. Call every city clerk and every county clerk, and maybe they have online filing and maybe they don't. And you're not good. But one of the things that happened, which is kind of awesome and I think will help, is that local campaign finance data now must move online. Jurisdictions in California are now required to post campaign statements and reports within 72 hours of them being filed. So that lowers barriers to those doing research. Still doesn't make it easy because you have to log into every city and county system, but it does make it so you don't have to make a bajillion phone calls, have them fax you campaign reports and things like that. So I think that's kind of it for me, and I will turn things over to Corin to offer some more perspective from a more practical perspective, and I'm going to turn myself off. Thank you, everyone.
Well, we'll see how practical I am. I don't know. I definitely I'm probably a little bit of a dinosaur. I'll just admit that right off the bat. Just wanted to kind of add on with some things. It's still very recent, so I'm still in some ways digesting some of the information about the changes to pandemic during the changes to campaigns during the pandemic, because you don't really have a enough kind of historical distance yet, I think, to really kind of get a sense of it. So I'm actually maybe going to pose some questions, and then also I think one of the pieces here is I need to give this disclaimer that pretty much everything I'm saying today is anecdotal, right? I haven't done any research on this topic. It's just my kind of lived experience in the field. When I got introduced, we mentioned one of my failed campaigns. Probably a lot of campaign consultants don't mention failed campaigns, but it is for me what really came to mind when I started thinking about what I was going to talk about today, because it was a campaign that happened in 2020 where the primary occurred without COVID and the general occurred with COVID. So I had two elections that should have been pretty similar in many ways, right? There's some differences between how you run in the primary and how you run in the general, but there was a huge difference in how they ended up running, because I was running one as I traditionally had run campaigns for the 18 previous years, and then running one in this completely new realm. So here's some just kind of anecdotal pieces from that campaign. Prior to that campaign, actually in kind of 2018, my campaigns had started using kind of Facebook groups to kind of organize kind of the volunteer leadership. We used to meet in person. We used to have like campaign steering committees every other week, and we'd get all the leadership of the campaign together, kind of all the key volunteers, sectors, distribute roles and things like that. And kind of 2 years before, we'd kind of taken an extra step to move it online. We set up these Facebook groups. When we first started doing it in 2018, And even in the primary in 2020, there was sort of a bar for entry into that group. Like there was a certain percent of the population that loved Facebook and was actively involved in that, but it couldn't become our main source of organizing because 2/3 of the leadership of the campaign would just not join. We'd send them, constant invites to join our little internal campaign group. That shifted dramatically from the primary into the general. And it was, to me, one of the most interesting things because I remember during this campaign, having many, on a campaign, many of your volunteers are seniors. Seniors, they're retired, they have more free time to get actively involved in campaigns. They often have a lot of great work experience that they can then kind of apply and bring into the campaign. And usually those seniors, though, didn't know Facebook. And so even though they were a kind of a key component of the campaign, organizing through social media, you could do a little bit through emails, but most of it was still done by kind of meeting with them in person. And that changed from the primary to the general. And I was just thinking about this, that I might have gained the misinterpretation from this campaign that everyone learned the internet during those 6 months. I can't say that that's true. I'm thinking that there might be a self-selection bias that might be going on, that everyone I continued to see involved in the campaign learned the internet, and there were some people who didn't, right, and who just dropped off of the face of the political world because there was no way for them to be involved. That being said, I saw this massive surge of seniors learning the internet, and I remember asking them, like, I didn't know you had a Facebook account. And they got Facebook accounts because they wanted to talk to their grandkids. They were no longer allowed to see them in person. They learned how to use Zoom, so that they could talk to their grandkids and other family members that they weren't allowed to see in person. And so they very quickly, a group that doesn't usually adapt quickly or change quickly, did out of pure necessity. And we saw this big shift of moving what we had done, a lot of the infrastructure of the campaigns, move pretty seamlessly from being in person to being virtual. And then there was a really interesting thing too that occurred is that I would actually say that we had an increased participation, right? Because there was kind of more isolation, that I actually, and I think this is why I might have missed the self-selection, right? I might have missed that there were some people that were just completely disappearing because I saw the numbers increase. And that just made me think that more people were gaining access to technology rather than acknowledging that it was really just a higher percentage of the senior population that was increasing. But we saw an increase in volunteerism from our primary to our general. Some of that just happens from primaries to generals, but it was such an increase that I could say, of the control group of previous elections, that the pandemic did lead to an increase in volunteerism. Similarly, in fundraising, Alana already mentioned this, there was an increase in small donor in internet donations, right? We would send out newsletters from the candidates. Again, this has been something we've been doing for a decade, usually to almost no response. Usually you would be happy if you got one donation off of a newsletter that you send out to 1,000 people, to all of a sudden starting to get a steady stream of donations. What I would say the numbers changed was from 0 to 1 donation from 1,000 people to maybe 10 to 20 donations. But that's a very significant increase if you think of it as a percentage. I would still say that donations, by and large, for my candidates, decreased. The amount of money we raised decreased. And this was partly because campaigns, local campaigns especially, are heavily funded by kind of the large donors within the community. I do a lot of fundraising in Sacramento, and I put on a lot of fundraisers. And as I always say, it's the same 200 people that you see at any fundraiser you go to in Sacramento. Whether it be, down in Elk Grove or in Natomas or in Citrus Heights, it's the same set of people. They travel around and they go to all the fundraisers in town, and they're people who've kind of sectioned off a portion of their budget for political donations, and those people were feeling unstable, right? They were a little bit concerned how this pandemic was going to hit them financially, and so a lot of them started to kind of clamp down on those donations. So we saw an overall decrease in large donations, but an increase not enough to make up for it in small donors. So, I mean, in some ways, there was kind of an enforced democratization, right? I think if you're thinking about kind of democratic principles, that's kind of what you want. You want more small donors, and you want more volunteers. And so that happened to a certain extent. So that might be the plus side of the pandemic. Walking was very tough. I definitely emphasized to my candidates the importance of walking, knocking on doors. I've had candidates, Kevin McCarty in 2006 when he first ran for city council, he knocked on every door in that city council district 3 times. You can do that in the local elections, right? That's one of the advantages of a local city council race or a park board member or a school board member versus some of these larger races like assembly and senate races where you have much larger districts. You can go and knock on every single door in the community. I felt this strong conflict within me of like, I want you to keep walking, candidate, but how are people going to react to you knocking on their door? Can you knock on their door and take 6 feet steps back and wear your mask and see how comfortable they feel? And if they don't answer the door, they don't. So one of the great questions Lenore asked me before this was what the effect on walking was, because she mentioned that more people might have been at home. It might have been in some ways a great time to walk. I have no data on that because the amount of walking we did, I got candidates to go out and knock on a few doors, but volunteers by and large, we moved them to phone banking from walking. And so I don't have any really good data sets from that. I think we're going to develop those data sets in this 2022 election, right? Because now there are still more people working from home. And a really interesting piece of that is the state is a very large employer in Sacramento, and whether the state workers are forced to come back into the office or not is going to have a dramatic difference. Generally, seniors tend to be home during the day. You get a certain bump after kind of school-aged children come home, but by and large, we tend to do most of our walking on weekends. Because that's when people are home. That's when you get the largest subset. And I think what might be interesting now is to see if some campaigns, and I'll probably be doing this on some of my campaigns, start walking during the week and seeing if they're getting enough people at home to kind of make that worth it. So what are some of my others? So virtual phone banks. I said that we moved a lot of people to phone banks. Because it makes sense, right? It's the way you can directly communicate with someone without giving them COVID. It hurt, though. Generally, I've been working in phone room floors since I first started in politics. And there's a certain level of kind of energy and just kind of magic that happens in a phone bank, right? You have all these people sitting, calling off of the same script in a room, and they kind of hear this buzz of people around them where they're not totally tuning in on what anyone else is around them saying, but they can kind of feel it, and then they can kind of hear if a couple other people are very enthusiastic. That enthusiasm tends to kind of blend into them, and they hear someone else starts doing really well. They kind of listen to that person, what they're saying, and maybe they adapt their script a little bit. So we tried to do this as virtual phone banks, get all our phone bankers to log in on Zoom, and it wasn't the same. It was in many ways like many Zoom meetings where people kind of popped on and said hi at the beginning, and then they popped off video, right? And then eventually they even maybe popped off sound or turned the sound off on their computer because, getting that balance so it was that hum that they would have gotten in a phone room floor. It'd be interesting to find out with technology if we could try to mimic that at some point. But we definitely didn't. Zoom and things, they're meant to pick up like one person's voice and make it very understandable rather than, give you that kind of background feel. We did also a dramatic increase on the text messaging. It would be interesting to see if it was really kind of pandemic related. It was just kind of a boom of that technology that so many kind of vendors jumped into that field and were providing it so cheaply. So in some ways, where recorded messages had been in years before, where you could pay like a couple cents per recorded message on someone's answering machine, text messages kind of got into that realm too. And the fun part of text banking is it did require some level of volunteers, right? Because you could have the message kind of blasted out, and then if people replied, you could field those out to volunteers, and then volunteers could continue the conversation through text. It didn't take very many volunteers, though. I mean, you could send out 1,000 text messages, and one volunteer was still relatively bored responding to the text messages that would come back from it. So it wasn't it was a volunteer activity, but not a volunteer intensive activity like phone banking was. And I definitely felt a lot of pain on the kind of just the phone banking energy and the turnout and my numbers that I was getting from phone banking during the pandemic. And that was always a big part of the GOTV of my campaigns. And then just to take this political a little bit, the biggest shift, and probably the part that I will never be able to totally get over on this election, is generally I've been involved in a lot of campaigns over the years. And I still remember very distinctly Alison Huber's race where she ran for assembly, and we had our election night party, and we were miserable because she was thousands of votes behind on election night. Just to find out her opponent even went to assembly orientation. He was all excited because he was going to be a new assembly member, and then 28 days later, when they certified the election, she was declared the winner, just in those last set of ballots. And at that point, we as kind of the Democratic Party, the Democratic consultants in town, recognized that Democrats are just not going to be doing well on election night, that Democrats tend to vote later than Republicans, and that, you just want to try and get kind of close. And that ran all the way up until this primary election, for instance. In the primary election in 2020, you still saw that kind of turnout shift. And then all of a sudden, in the general election in 2020, and again, it was very new at the time because the pandemic had just happened, but the president at the time, Donald Trump, was opposed to this kind of mail-in ballot system, and was saying a lot of negative things about the post office and whether you could trust the post office. And I really significantly felt this in this election because we saw very high numbers of Democrats mailing in their ballots early. It was interesting in the primary, right? It was a contested Democratic primary and not a contested Republican primary. So Republicans were kind of voting early in the primary. They knew they were voting for Donald Trump, or if they didn't like him, they weren't voting for him, but they knew how they were going to vote. And Democrats had all these choices, right? They had Hillary Clinton and not Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and other choices this is Elizabeth Warren, yes, and Buttigieg, and yeah, so they had a good set of candidates. So Democrats kind of held on to their ballots and voted very late in the primary. Then all of a sudden you come to the general now, and there's this massive distrust within local Republicans. And I was surprised even kind of Sacramento Republicans who, in the district that I was dealing with are very moderate Republicans by and large. But election day, as we were going and we were looking at polling places, it was by and large very high Republican turnout election day, going in and voting in person, even though it was a mail-only election, right? Even though everyone had gotten a mail ballot, a complete shift. So on election night, it was the opposite of how it had been on Alison Huber's race. In Greg Fishman's race, we started out with a really nice lead on election night, kind of excited about winning, knowing that we'd kind of seen a very high Republican turnout that day and that our lead would slip, but thinking it was large enough that it would hold on for us, and then just watching this just massive Republican surgence of election day voting. So it'd be really interesting to see if that shift continues and kind of the relationship that the two parties have with the trust of the post office, as not a factor I'd ever really thought of in elections before, but something that needs to be examined. I'm just seeing if there's any other kind of pieces here. Yeah, I think that kind of covers. Oh, and then Alana kind of mentioned this FPPC, and most of my clients do use accountants now. But I did, being here in Sacramento, in some ways you have an even easier time interfacing with the FPPCs. It's always been a little bit hard to get them on the phone, to call them, even when they were only getting, the 300 calls instead of the 1,000 calls. But they've always been very approachable in person. And many times when I was dealing with local candidates, really down ticket races like park boards and school board candidates, I would say, hey, just take your 410 and walk in. And if you've never filled out this form before, they'll help you. They'll make it easy. You'll walk out with an FPPC ID number. You'll be official. You'll be off and running. And it was a great benefit that local Sacramentans kind of had in this process. And with the pandemic shutdown, you know, we lost that ability, right? Not only were we in the same backlog that everyone else was in, and I did have some candidates who kind of were trying to decide if they wanted to run or not, and knowing that it was going to take months just to even get an FPPC ID number was kind of a effect on the decision of whether they wanted to run. And then I think also, even though we see this increased technology is kind of now a necessity, right, that we have abilities to file these forms online, which makes sense during a pandemic, we've got to recognize that some of the population, even incumbents who are already in office, may see this as kind of a barrier to continuing. Like, oh, I have all this extra wait time. Oh, I have to learn, you know, these net file systems and stuff like that. You know, if they're a high enough office, a board of supervisors, city council member, they'll hire an accountant. It'll be fine in a large enough city, that is. I mean, if it's a small town, maybe not. But for many of these very down ticket races, this extra hassle when they don't want to professionalize their campaign may just be a reason for them not to run at all. So that's I started with the positive and I ended with the not quite as positive. But yeah, I'll be open to, we'll be open to questions. Thank you.
Thanks. And so now we'll turn to questions, and I think I'll start with, see if anybody in the audience has some questions. Joe, go ahead.
I have a question as well as a comment. Your presentation leaned a lot towards the digital divide and communications and that kind of thing, which was really good. You know, when Obama ran, one of the advantages, and history will show this later on, was that he found out early, okay, how to use this digital thing in terms of money. Okay, he turned big money, little money into big money, and he caught on to the fact that digital and some of the other kinds of things that we use now was the way to go. And now during the pandemic, we see that we had some problems with communications, but you have up there, you said something about the scant, okay, the elections has historically been scant given the difficulty of gathering data across multiple jurisdictions. Will you or do you have any comments regarding the political hindrance from abroad across the country, because it did have a trickle-down effect on how people voted as related to the messaging about the Democrats versus the Republican. They came out with this term called, what's bad news? What did Trump call it? Yeah, fake news, right? We came out with all of this stuff, and then we even had foreign interference in our elections. So how did that impact, or how do you see the future of those kinds of things impacting our digital world and our communications world as we know it today?
Sure. I'll start, and then the scientists here can correct me when I get off, because I definitely they're limited. I thought that was great what you mentioned about the Obama campaign kind of revolutionizing online fundraising. I mean, I think that the data's in on that, and that was definitely the start of what has now finally kind of trickled down to local elections, right? I think in some ways the pandemic helped accelerate that, because national elections tend to lead the way. And I think I remember in 2008 and in 2012 when Obama was raising all this money online, all my candidates were saying, why can't I raise money online? And it's like, well, Obama can send his email out to 20 million people. and if he gets a 0.001% response rate, he's going to still raise a ton of money. We can send it out to 5,000 people maybe. With our 0.001 response rate, we're going to raise $0, right? So it was much harder to use that system of online fundraising until, in some ways, the pandemic hit and it forced more people to become digitally aware. And I think with that increased digital awareness, you saw enough of a gain that it made kind of digital fundraising worth it. It's still a very small part of local fundraising. Even though it's kind of now become a component of it, the vast majority, 80–90% of the dollars raised, at least in the races I'm involved in, are raised from kind of traditional donors, what we would call them. As that was kind of one piece of what you talked about. The other piece, again, I think that there's a difference between national elections, which I can't really speak to much, and local elections. Misinformation has always kind of been a standard thing within local elections. People can write on their mail pieces that they send out whatever they want, and they've always been able to do that. It seems like the increase in misinformation has really become more of a nationwide, federal kind of problem, and maybe even a state, though, again, this is not my area of expertise. At local elections, it continues to be a pest, but not something that has kind of broken us, right? It's not candidates that are running on completely, misinformation-based platforms that by and large are winning their races. So it's been an issue, but it's kind of stayed at a steady constant amongst locals.
I'll add just a tiny bit, which is that I think I would love to see someone do a research paper where they did actually start gathering the data on how often local candidates are using electronic fundraising, because I actually think that it's going up, right? Just anecdotally from what we know, more and more local candidates calling and asking about how to accept contributions via Venmo, how to report those contributions. So, I would like to see that happen. Like, I would like to see that research done, because you can now get those reports online, and they have to say how that money, was it a check? Was it from Venmo? Was it from Anadot? Like, how did it get to them? So you could gather that information. And I think that would be a useful line of inquiry. And then also, one of the challenges of the online fundraising for someone like a local city candidate versus Obama is, again, that question of the professionalization of local races, and do they know how to report electronic contributions correctly? Do they know how to use Venmo? Some of them thinking Venmo could be their bank account, but it can't be. Things like that. So I, from a practical perspective, would like to see, not even like to see, because it's happening. That training is there. It's more helping local candidates. Like, I don't want to see local races have to become super professionalized, right? Like, I don't want to see that happen. I feel as if it will dissuade people from running, and I don't want that. So again, this is nothing about, reporting or anything of that nature. It's just the nature of using electronic fundraising sites changes what you have to know as a local candidate, right? What you have to know how to do as a local candidate. And so that, I think, is just a concern. And I just wanted to put a plug also, not so much in terms of disinformation, but the FPPC has a great program that they do, and you can see it on their website. It's up now, for where locals, anyone can report an ad where they think someone hasn't used appropriate disclosures. So it's not exactly disinformation, right? Because it's just political ads. And so it's not about what's in the ad. It's about whether people have appropriately disclosed who they are and who's paying for the ad, right? So for transparency. So it's a very cool program. They get a lot of input from citizens about ads where they think that people have not done appropriate disclosures, so they don't know who made the ad and who paid for it. So you could go on the website and see that, and it's a really cool program to be able to look at that. So it's not disinformation quite like you were talking about, but in terms of at least knowing who's paying for the ad, right, that information is there.
Let me take a couple questions from here, and then I also want to give a chance for there's some no questions at home right now. Okay, so we'll take more questions from here. Go ahead, sir.
I actually have two questions, if you don't mind. One is, did the issue of coronavirus change the messaging? Were constituents or voters asking about their positions at a local level on coronavirus? Certainly the national level vaccines, mask mandates might come up, but is that something that, did you send out a mailer about, with the candidate in a mask, things like that? My second question was, did campus closures, college and university campus closures, affect how you recruited college volunteers?
Okay. Yes, very much so. I mean, it was, it became the number one topic on every poll, right, was coronavirus. But in some ways, it happened so fast that that it felt like every candidate was trying to basically say the same thing, right? That we're gonna protect safety of everyone, and then we're gonna help rebuild the economy afterwards. That was definitely included in different messaging, and sometimes we were trying to use validators about who people's supporters were. And there has been, I mean, I know in some of the school board races, especially, and I think we're seeing it now actually more in 2022 than we did in 2020 because it was so new. There's been a movement to remove school board members that were supportive of mask mandates in schools. So you may see a wave of school board members retire early because they don't want to fight against that, or get ousted in local elections for their support for mask mandates at their schools, or shutting down the school, right, or having school closures. Trying to think about college students, again, we had kind of the primary election without COVID, so we had kind of many students kind of already engaged in the campaign. We had some students who, stayed, home, and home could have been a different city, and so we had probably more volunteers that weren't physically in the district that they were campaigning in. That kind of stopped being a barrier, just like it's kind of stopped being a barrier for education in some ways, right? People are doing more remote learning. But I don't know that I saw an increase. I would say in some ways, maybe anecdotally, I saw a little bit of a decrease, just in kind of the instability that was going on in their lives, that they weren't, and I guess as opposed to seniors who really, in many ways, saw political campaigns as ways to get involved and engaged in their communities, I think college students were probably more focused on, kind of peer groups and stuff like that. But I definitely did have in my campaigns a good, strong group of both high school and college-age volunteers, which are a very big part of campaigns. But it's harder. It's harder to engage them remotely than it was when we were able to engage them online. Again, a lot of volunteer activities revolve around that kind of camaraderie that you usually have. Did I answer both questions? I don't know. Do you guys want to add on?
Andy, go ahead, sir.
With the current state of the economy and with inflation on the rise and it affecting many of the smaller contributions that you would normally see for this time of year and for the 2022 midterms, do you think we'll see a reversal of that increase that we saw in 2020 of small donor contributions?
I expect those small contributions just won't go as far, right? I mean, we'll probably see more small contributions. I expect that it will continue to increase. But the cost of running a campaign is probably outpacing the increase in small donors. And I think you are starting to see, as the instability starts to wear off, the large donors kind of reasserting their dominance within campaigns. So it's a dominance that never completely went away.
That's pretty much what I would respond. So there's no point in my repeating it, but that's exactly what I would say.
Let me ask you guys a question. You've talked just a little bit about differences across groups in terms of who is advantaged or disadvantaged. age and sort of technological sophistication, but do you have any speculations about any other distinctions across either gender differences in terms of whether this advantages or disadvantages, or does this say for a race for county supervisor, does this make it even more advantageous than before if you'd gone through this kind of thing you as a school board member or as a city council member or things like that? Just any other distinctions across groups in terms of the move towards.
I don't think you're going to see gender differences. I mean, historically in campaigns, at this point, there are barriers, obviously, but, the research we even did, right? Like female candidates win when they have the same essential, qualifications, experience, things like that. Female candidates are able to raise as much money as male candidates are, right? So no, I don't actually think, and at the local level, that is where so many female candidates begin. For upper, right, that I don't think there'll be a barrier in that sense, right? I don't think, again, for me, as I watch the pandemic and the changes which Corin spoke to as well, I think that it's going to be possibly an age barrier, again, as people don't want to learn these new things that aren't going to go bye-bye, right? We're just not going to get rid of some of these things, especially things like NetFile and all of those are not going anywhere. Right. In fact, they're increased probably in use. So, my concerns are more, I think, age. But
I agree with all that. I mean, we saw an increase of women running, especially in 2016. I would say that was, to me, at least locally, especially the real year of the women, getting involved in local campaigns. But I didn't see any major shift around the pandemic. I agree. I think it benefits those who are more technologically savvy, right? Because more and more of campaigning is moving to the online world, and thus maybe benefits people who are younger. That was one piece I neglected to mention about small donor funding. One of the big advantages that Obama had in small donor fundraising over local candidates, not just a larger constituency, but name recognition is a huge piece of of small donor fundraising. And most people don't know who their school board member or city council member is. So when you're getting an appeal from someone you don't know, you're much less likely to donate than someone you do know. So that's a barrier that I think is slightly starting to get mitigated, again, as people get more and more engaged in the online world, but still a barrier for the small donors.
Just a quick question about the small donor. Did you see any shift as relates to grassroots efforts from candidates? Usually candidates can just sit back and kick back, but this time, did they have to do more work as relates? Did they have to do more personal calls? They couldn't walk and knock on doors, but they were forced to do some more of the work themselves, for lack of a better term. I'm not trying to call them lazy. That's another term I'm looking for, but they had to actually do some other kinds of things because of the COVID, which kind of resemble some grassroots efforts. I was happy to see it because it took the money. To get the money, you had to work for it, okay? And it wasn't big money. It was dissected in pieces of money. People still know how to use pieces of money, but the point is, it kind of took the big money thing out of it. So I was happy to see candidates having to do more, okay, as it relates to some of the grassroots, knocking on the doors, talking to the people, having some personal kind of communications with people.
I will try. I don't know that I have a good answer to this. I think definitely a lot of what you said very much makes sense. On some level, the large donors are the people that the candidates tend to spend a lot of time talking to, and small donor fundraising tends to be more like blast emails, newsletters, things like that. solicitations where you're doing less one-on-one, right? And, if you had to make a call for every $5 donation you were going to get, I mean, it just isn't a cost-effective, time-effective way of fundraising. And so it kind of has transitioned the style of fundraising. And again, maybe I'm a dinosaur. The vast majority of fundraising I still see is kind of that large donor-focused fundraising. You'd also kind of just mentioned campaigning in general, and this was a piece that I had written down, but I forgot to mention, was that in the primary election, we had a very active house party program where we would identify members of the community that wanted to open up their house and invite people in. And then, COVID happened. We already had some house parties scheduled, and it was like, okay, what are we going to do with these? So we tried to kind of move them to virtual house parties, on Zoom instead of in person. And we actually saw, kind of like similar to some of the other areas, where we saw a boost in the number of people who were attending. But similarly, there's kind of less engagement with those who do. I mean, I think that's part of the transition to moving things online. It's easier for people to join, so you see a greater number of it. That's kind of the democratization part. But some of those people just kind of lurk, right? They don't have their camera on. They don't ask any questions. And you don't really know what they got out of it. And so it was, again, I think the data is still just too new to really have a sense of some of the stuff that you're talking about. But there's no doubt there's been a change. And it's had kind of multiple factors. It'll just be interesting to see which factors have become more powerful over the course of over history and as this continues to transition.
Yeah. Do we have time for one more? Yeah. Okay. One more. Last question.
So I know when you do mailers, you oftentimes get the addresses, the voter addresses from the registrar, but you can also get email addresses from the registrar. And but the problem is if you put those into Constant Contact or SurveyMonkey, is that what it's called, SurveyMonkey? They won't allow you to mail them unless you have the permission of the voter. And so in a campaign I worked on, we sent out all the, this is how, we're going to save money. We're not going to have to mail physical pieces of mail, but we can email them. It'll be cheaper. And Constant Contact said, you can't do that unless you have the permission of the person receiving it. Do you see that maybe the law will change or Constant Contact or SurveyMonkey and anything will change their policies?
More questions are under you. I think outside vendors like PDI will start getting better at collecting email addresses. Most people don't put their email address on their voter registration card. It's kind of like 10%-ish, 10 to 20%. Then vendors kind of come in and add some email addresses using different tools. I mean, if a big vendor kind of like Google came involved in this, you'd probably see more ability to do that. That's more likely to happen probably on the national level or state level than it would be Google. That probably doesn't see school board races, at least yet, as kind of a way to make money. But we have done some e-blasts. You can do it directly from some of these voter files that you can purchase. They'll let you send out. They charge you, 1 to 3 cents to send out emails. It's not enough, the 30% maybe of people that they have, and then that's not counting the fact that people have spam filters and things like that to really to break that down. Email has not replaced physical mail yet as a way to. It'd be great for the environment when it does, and one would say it's inevitably going to, right? But where that is in the future, I think it's still a ways out.
I just want to add one quick thing there, which is, again, I can speak to the reporting requirements for these things, right? So for me, what's interesting about all of that is anything that costs money has to be reported. And so these new technologies are challenging for candidates, for local candidates, right? We're not talking about state candidates and federal candidates who are professional and they don't know. They have somebody who knows and they pay them and that person does it all, make sure everything's in compliance. But for a small local city council candidate, they don't have that same they don't have a hired consultant necessarily to make sure they're in compliance with how they report that vendor and the payment of that. So that's more my concern, is as we change the nature of local campaigning, we're changing who can potentially run for office. And that's of deep concern to me.
And that's, I think, probably a very provocative way to end this seminar. I want to thank Alana and Corin for, I think, really interesting points about elections. I want to thank the audience for very good questions and really pushed everybody a little farther. Thank you, everybody, for coming today.
Thank you.
Okay.
You know, I haven't, so what prompted this? This
Good.
was not,
It was
and
fun.